Hola clase. En este video vamos a continuar aprendiendo sobre el subjuntivo. En el video anterior hablábamos de qué es el subjuntivo y cómo formar el subjuntivo, cuándo usar el subjuntivo. So in the last video, we talked about what is the subjunctive, how to form it, and you form it by taking the verb, how it would be conjugated in the present indicative, and just treating it as the opposite, treating AR verbs like ER verbs, and treating ER and IR verbs like AR verbs. And we talked a little bit about the acronym WEIRDO, which tells you when to use the subjunctive, when precisely is it for. So the W in weirdo, wish, want, desire. So if you want that things happen, and you're not just indicating that they happen, but if you want or wish that they happen or desire that they happen, then that's one time that you need to use the subjunctive. If you're not just indicating, remember, that's why we call that present tense the present indicative tense. It's just used for indicating. If you're not just indicating that something happens, but you're saying, I'm happy that, or I'm glad that, or I'm sad that something happened, then that's another opportunity to use the subjunctive. Impersonal expression, es increíble que ella tenga 10 años. Request or recommendation, yo recomiendo que tú abraces un cacto. So I recommend that you hug a cactus. Doubt, if you're doubting that something happens, then that something happening should be in the subjunctive. The I doubt part is just an present indicative because you are indicating that you doubt. You are indicating that, but the thing that comes after is the subjunctive part, the part that's after the trigger. And then finally, the word ojalá, which is a fun word. Okay, and so together those make up weirdo, and those are when to use the subjunctive. So today we're going to put a little twist on this. We are going to talk about irregulars. So every tense we've studied so far has irregulars in it, and the subjunctive is no exception. But the good news is all of the ways in which subjunctive verbs are irregular, I should say most of the ways in which subjunctive verbs are irregular, you're already familiar with them because those same types of irregularities exist in tenses you've seen already. So that is the good news. So when we talk about irregular verbs, it's easiest to start, I think, with stem changing verbs. So you know stem changing verbs from the present indicative tense. Often it's one vowel in part of the stem that becomes two vowels. And so dormir becomes duerm. I'm not sure why it has that. Okay, or that, or that. Okay. So in the present tense, when you're conjugating dormir, the stem is dorm, but it becomes duerm when you conjugate it in all of the forms except for the nosotros and the vosotros form. That same irregularity is going to exist in the subjunctive. And so dormir being an IR verb, it's going to have AR verb endings in the subjunctive. Okay, so we're going to use duerm, except it's going to be duerma for the yo form, duermas for the tu form, duerma again for the LA usted form. So remember that the yo form and the LA usted form are exactly the same in the subjunctive. Just like in the present indicative tense, we're going to switch back to using dorm, dormamos, dormais, and then duerman. Okay, and so that is how our verb is conjugated for dormir. So we're still doing what we talked about last time, treating AR verbs like ER and treating ER and IR verbs like AR. But we're keeping any regularity that we've talked about. So entender. So how would you say I understand? Yo entiendo. So the E becomes an IE. So entienda, because this is an ER verb. Entiendas, entienda. Pedir. Okay? To say I order something in a restaurant, it's yo pido. Okay? But we're going to make it pida. Pida, pidas, pida. And then sentir. It's going to be sient. Again, it's an IR verb. And so sienta, sientas, sienta. So let's use a couple of these in sentences here. So let's think back to what might trigger us to have to use the subjunctive. What might be a subjunctive trigger? Should we wish that somebody do one of those things? Is it important that? So here's what we'll do for our first one. Es importante que duermas por 8 horas cada noche. Es importante que duermas por 8 horas cada noche. Yo dudo que los estudiantes entiendan. Now, if I was indicating that they understand something, I would say los estudiantes entienden. But I'm going to say entiendan el concepto. Now, not everything that looks like a trigger is in fact a subjunctive trigger, because if I put es obvio que the students understand the concept, I would say los estudiantes entienden el concepto. That does not trigger the subjunctive, because if it's obvious that, it's showing certainty. And we use the subjunctive when it's showing less than certainty, when it's expressing doubt, or even just no es obvio. So even by putting a no in front of the es obvio, that's expressing a little bit of doubt. Entiendan el concepto. Okay? So just keep that in mind, that just because something has a K at the end of it, some little phrase, doesn't mean that it's a subjunctive. All right? So that is the first category of irregular verbs. That's any verb that in the present indicative was a stem changer. There is another category of verbs called go verbs, and again, this is something that you are familiar with, or depending on your teacher, they might have been called yo-go verbs, because they're irregular in only the yo form, and they're irregular because they get a G inserted. So, pongo, for example, in the present indicative. But then when you go to continue conjugating it, it's pones. Make that a little smaller here. Okay. So what we're going to do in the subjunctive is we're going to keep pong as our, anytime this happens in the present tense with a go or a sco, we're going to keep that yo form stem, and that's going to be our stem for all of our subjunctive verbs. So I put would be yo pongo in the present indicative. And if I want to say it's important that I put something, then poner is an ER verb. It's got to be like an AR verb, ponga. Okay, so we're going to keep that pong and we're going to make it ponga. So ponga, pongas, ponga. Pongamos, pongáis, pongan. Salir. The verb salir in the yo form would be salgo. Yo salgo is I leave or I go out. So I'm going to take off that O. I'm going to keep my salg, salga, salgas, salga. Decir. Yo digo. It's digo, dices, dice. So this is a yogo verb, but it's also a stem changing verb because the stem is des, D-E-C, but it becomes dis when you actually conjugate it. So this is irregular in two ways. We're going to keep both of those irregularities. It's going to become diga. It's going to become digas and diga again. So we're going to keep the I and then we're going to keep the G. Merecer. Now this was not as common of a word. The verb merecer. If I conjugate it in the present indicative, merezco. But because it's an ER verb, merezca, merezcas, merezca. And let's do a few more. Tener, we know it's yo tengo, so they're gonna all start with teng. Oh, not sure why these are red. Change that. Tenga, tengas, tenga. Conocer is another of those SCO verbs. Conozco. It's going to be conozco, conoces. But we're going to make it conozca, conozcas, conozca. Hacer, it's going to be hago. But we're going to make it haga, hagas, haga. And finally, venir. Vengo. But we're going to make it venga, vengas, venga. Okay, let's do, before talking about our next category, let's do the same thing and let's use a handful of these in some example sentences with some triggers. Okay, let's look back at our weirdo. I could wish, want, or desire something. I could doubt that something happens. I could be an emotion that something happens. Let's see. Espero que mi amigo. So there I have a trigger that would trigger the subjunctive. Let's say put his money, ponga su dinero en el banco. Let's do another one. Let's do a doubt this time. Dudo que ella venga a tiempo. Now, in our trigger, it's sometimes just really easiest to use a yo form in your trigger, but of course you can use any form. You could say, mis amigos y yo dudamos que, and that could be our trigger. Okay, we could all be doubting that, and then we could all be doubting that any other person does anything. So, mis amigos y yo dudamos que Miguel conozca a alguien famoso. ¿Quién? J-Lo. Mis amigos y yo dudamos que Miguel conozca a J-Lo. So we doubt that Miguel knows J-Lo. All right. Es importante que digas la verdad. It's important that you say or tell the truth. Okay, so those are some examples. Okay, the next category of verbs. This is probably a new category of verbs for you. Actually, it's not. This category exists in the preterite. So actually, we've been talking about kinds of irregular verbs from the subjunctive that are also irregular in the present indicative. So we've been kind of comparing the subjunctive and the present indicative so far. This category actually comes from the subjunctive. So the verb empezar, buscar, pagar. These are called cargar-zar verbs. And let's start with a gar verb, actually. Let's start with the last one. Now, the reason for this type of stem change makes sense, or this type of irregularity, rather, makes sense because I'll show you. Okay, pagar. I'll make these smaller again and less bold, not bold. Okay, there we go. Now, these are AR verbs, all of them. Cars, gars, and zars are all ARs, so we're going to conjugate them like they're ER verbs. And so you would think that it would be, now this is not the right way. I'm just trying to show you what you might think it would be so that you'll understand why they need to be irregular. Okay? So if you ever learned about letters and the sounds that they make, G's, for example, how they can make a G sound or a H sound, and how do you know when you're reading a particular word, whether it's making a G sound or a H sound? If you've ever learned anything like that in Spanish before, this probably is going to make some sense because obviously you read the infinitive here, pagar, the G is making a G sound. But if you read this word, P-A-G-E, you might be tempted to say paje, right? Because when a G has an E after it, or certain other letters, and E is one of them, then it makes a H sound. And so what we really don't want to have happen is we don't want to have this verb, pagar, meaning to pay, with a G sound, pago, pagas, paga, but then have to have a different sound because then it doesn't even sound like it's the same verb, right? And so we don't want it to all of a sudden have to be paje, pajes, paje. Or even if we said, well, okay, then pronounce it page, pages, page. We don't want people to be mispronouncing it when they're reading it, right? So we want to make it obvious that this is a G sound. And so the way to do that would be to insert a U, page. So this isn't pronounced pague, it's page. But now people would just read it that way. Pages and page again. So with gar verbs, we get a U. And that happens in the preterite as well. Not in all of the places, but when you say I paid, yo pague, it's actually got to be with a U, yo pague. But with pagaste, so I'm just kind of showing you the preterite down here, pague, pagaste, pago. You don't need the U because the putting aste at the end makes the G have a G sound anyway. Okay, so really it's just the yo form that needs it in the preterite. But all of the forms need it in the subjunctive in order to keep that G sound. Okay, so let me erase this preterite off of here. So pague, pagues, pague, paguemos, pagues, paguen. Okay, buscar. The same thing would happen. If I put busc and then with an E, this the C would probably just make a S sound. So busce. And we want it to sound like it's part of the same verb as buscar, busco, buscas, busca. So how do we make that K sound? We actually don't even use the C anymore. We use a Q with a U. Okay. This busque, it's that way in the preterite. So yo busque, the C is gonna become a Q, U. But we don't do the accents with the subjunctive. It's just busque. Okay, so there's a difference between busque and busque. They're spelled the same except for the accent on the E. Okay, so busque, busques, busque. Now, empezar is a little different. Empezar is also a stem changer. So it's going to be empieza, all right? Empiezo, empiezas. So it's going to be empiezo in the present indicative, empiezas. Okay, so we're going to keep the stem change, just like we talked about up here with the stem changing section. Okay, entender became entienda, entiendas. So empezar is going to become empies, empies. Okay, but it's also a cargar-zar verb. And the zars, they just get a C. So empiece, empieces. Now the nice thing is that you really only have to worry about these cargar-zar verbs when you're writing. Because when you're talking, you know that pagar is an AR verb, paga, pagas, paga. You would say page, pages, page. When you're speaking, you don't really have to worry about the fact that you're adding a U. You're going to be saying it correctly anyway. Buscar, busca, busco, buscas, busca. You're going to say busque, busques, busque, right? And the same thing with empezar. You're probably going to say empiece, empieces, empiece. Okay, so those are our cargar-zar verbs. And lastly, there are a few verbs that are just completely irregular. Every tense seems to have them. All right, and so here's what we're going to do. And I like using these tables. All right. And so let me just put some of these verbs up in here. Okay. Okay. Now, dar, okay, it's an AR verb. You know you have to conjugate it like an ER verb. You'd probably just say day, days, day, right? And you'd be correct. You'd be saying it correctly. But they just have accent marks. Day, days, day. Okay, and that's why the word dar is considered irregular, because you have to remember there's accent marks. And I guess that's not so hard to remember, because whenever you have two words, two different words spelled the same way, like L and L, right? L for the and L for he. One of them typically has an accent mark, right? The word he, that L has an accent mark. Or two and two. Two meaning you, and then there's two meaning your. Two meaning you has an accent mark. Or C and C. C can mean yes, or it can mean if. If it has an accent mark, it's yes. If it doesn't have an accent mark, it's if. So this is just another one of those, because day means of, but day is also the subjunctive yo form and the subjunctive la usted form of give, and so it has an accent mark. And then the rest of them have accent marks too. Okay? The verb haber is completely irregular, because instead of ab, it's going to get I. Now it's an ER verb, so we need to conjugate it like AR verb, so it's aya, aya, ayas, aya. Now actually, oh no, I'm not going to say what I was going to say. Okay, the verb saber. Instead of sab, our stem is going to be sep, sep. And of course, you need to conjugate it like an AR verb, so sepa, sepas, sepa. Our verb ir, you could kind of think of the verb ir as an irregular yogo verb if you wanted to. So ir is irregular in the yo form. Well, actually, it's irregular all throughout. It's voy. So we're going to keep that Y. Let's see here. Okay, but it's going to be vaya. Vayas. Vaya. Vayamos, vayáis, vayan. A star, you would think it would just be este, but we're going to, again, put accent marks just like we did with the verb dar. Este, estés, este. And then with ser, sea. Seas. And I guess because if you take the ER off of ser, and then it's just going to be sa, well, no, we need it to look enough like the original verb so that we know what verb it is, that we're actually just going to keep the E and add the A to it. So sea, seas, sea. Okay, just like we did before, let's come up with some triggers that would trigger the subjunctive. And let's try and use some Kargar-Zar verbs, and let's also try to use some completely irregular verbs. So here, let's espero que tú te sientas. We want to say that you feel better. So I hope that is our trigger. Espero que is our trigger. Okay, tú. Now, sentir is the verb. Okay, and it's me siento mal, right? Or como te sientes. So it's an IR verb, so you would conjugate it like an ER verb in the present indicative, but now it needs to be like an AR verb, so sientas. Espero que tú te sientas mejor. So I hope that you feel better. Dudo que, let's do a doubting one. What do I want to say? Now, one thing about this, the verb haber is where we get the word I from, like I meaning there is or there are. And so if you want to say, I doubt that there are something, or I doubt that there is something, then you would say just aya. But it can also be a verb. And I don't think we've learned how to use that verb as a verb yet. All we've learned is that I means there is. So forget the ayas and the ayamos and those. Just actually don't even think of it as a verb. Just think of it as there's I and then there's aya, which is the subjunctive version. So dudo que haya means I doubt that there is. Dudo que haya comida en el refrigerador. So dudo que haya comida en el refrigerador. Okay. Dudo que Miguel. Good thing we don't have a Miguel in our class, because I kind of use Miguel as the go-to pick on this poor Miguel person name. Dudo que Miguel sepa el alfabeto. So anytime I want to say something that wouldn't be super flattering, dudo que Miguel sepa el alfabeto. I doubt that Miguel knows the alphabet. Okay. Espero que Papá Noel me dé muchos regalos esta Navidad. I hope that Santa brings me many presents this Christmas. And then ojalá. And then remember, we don't need our K. We don't need K necessarily with this word ojalá. Ojalá vayas al supermercado. So hopefully you go to the supermarket. And then ojalá would be our trigger. Okay. Your assignment is to come up with 10 original sentences. In those 10 original sentences, all I'm looking for is that you use a variety of weirdo triggers. And these are original sentences to you, that you use a variety of conjugations, yo form, to form, LA usted form. That means both in the trigger and in the rest of the sentence too. And then I'd like you to use a variety of the different types of irregular verbs. Every one of these should be irregular, though, because in the last assignment, you had a similar assignment with just the regular verbs. So I don't need you to repeat regular verbs. So this time I just want you to repeat, or I want you to spend those 10 sentences focusing on just the irregular verbs. You can use regular verbs, obviously, for the verbs in your trigger, right? Those are just going to be old present indicative verbs. Now here's something, just a little warning of what not to do. So some of you, especially those of you who want to get creative, you might say, okay, we've learned the past tense too. What if I hoped that something, or what if I doubted that something? What if I want to use a past tense verb in my trigger? And I'm just going to caution you, don't do that, because we haven't learned that yet. So just like there's a past tense, there's a past tense of the subjunctive as well. And so just don't go there. But it works the way you would think it would work. If you put a present tense verb in the trigger, then you need to use the present subjunctive, which is what this tense is. I'm just calling it the subjunctive, but it's the present subjunctive. If you use a past tense verb, whether it's the preterite or the imperfect, doesn't matter, then there's a past subjunctive. Now, there's not a past subjunctive for the preterite and a past one for the imperfect. It doesn't matter. It's just if you use one of the two past tenses, you have to use the past subjunctive to go along with it. So just avoid all of that. And every verb that you use in your trigger should be just a present indicative verb, plain old present tense verb. Okay? So that is your homework.